Part 7, From Genocide to Global War, concluding Chapter 27, first published January 2024. Even as the International Court of Justice heard the case for genocide against Israel, its onslaught against the Palestinians threatened to mushroom into a global war. Israel is unlikely to convince the court that it has been a victim of terrorism after 75 years continuously terrorizing the original inhabitants of the Holy Land, and after grass-mowing attacks on Gaza almost every other year since 2008. Unsuccessful in eradicating the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, in spite of the awesome toll of its bombing campaign, Israel has already resorted to provocative, targeted assassinations in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. Netanyahu, whose political fortunes seem to depend on many more months of war, seems to hope to drag the U.S. into a regional war. Will the U.S. take the bait? Endless war was the nightmare promise of Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush back in 2001, following the attacks on the World Trade Center that year. The world has lived that nightmare ever since in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the former Yugoslavia, Yemen, Ukraine, and at home. The nightmare threatens to morph into global catastrophe as Israel's U.S.-backed genocidal slaughter against Gaza hits the brink of regional war in West Asia. It could easily become global, involving both Russia and China. Such a war, even if it did not blow up the world, would destroy the global economy the U.S. and its allies want to dominate. While Biden and Blinken caution Israel about civilian casualties and international law, they rush endless tons of munitions to keep the slaughter going. As 2023 ended, Israel had begun withdrawing ground troops from northern Gaza. The onslaught failed to eradicate the resistance, but succeeded in crushing tens of thousands of civilians, mainly women and children, and demolishing homes, hospitals, schools, and Gaza's entire civilian infrastructure. How has all this happened? According to Biden, Blinken, and Netanyahu, it's the fault of their enemies, terrorists in Palestine and dictators in Russia and China. But is that true? A deep fog of lies and false propaganda has been a major strategic weapon of war for the U.S. war makers and their allies. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It's part of the glory of the American experiment, declared former U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo in May 2019, bragging to a college audience in Texas. That unusual admission reflects the bipartisan official U.S. approach to maintaining global hegemony. The lie machine and the war machine are linked. The military-industrial complex and AIPAC, American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, are among the largest political donors to politicians in Washington. Together with the major oil corporations, the largest banks, and big business as a whole, they forge conformity to the official narrative, especially in time of war. They largely control the mainstream media. The big lie is the weapon of choice for Biden and his neocons in waging the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, in support for Israel's genocide in Palestine, in the hybrid war against China, and in a wider war in West Asia. In each case, the path to peace must first break through the official lies. Sensational lies uncritically parroted. Israel tried desperately to control the narrative in a series of fabrications that immediately unraveled, wrote Electronic Intifada. Sensational lies about rape and beheaded babies were quietly retracted despite being uncritically parroted by mainstream Western media. Biden repeated the Israeli narrative verbatim, even after it was debunked. The biggest lie is about terror and terrorism. Zionist Israel has waged permanent terror against the Palestinians since 1948, always with massive and lavish support from the U.S. and its allies. Just as Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress were called terrorists by the apartheid rulers of South Africa with U.S. support, the Palestinians are considered terrorists because they reject the Israeli theft of their land and have fought against terrible odds to get it back. Hamas and the rest of the Palestinian resistance are called terrorists because they lead this fight. The real terror is on the other side, as both the U.S. and Israel use brute force to protect their theft and to maintain the racist repression and expulsion of the land's original inhabitants. In the case of the conflict in Ukraine, the U.S. has spent billions over decades to transform that country into an effective battering ram against Russia, culminating in the 2014 coup that brought Ukrainian fascists to power. It then backed these fascists in attacks against Russian speakers in eastern and southern Ukraine, while NATOizing the Ukrainian military and bludgeoning its European NATO allies to support the effort. When Russia stepped in to stop these attacks, Biden raised a hysterical hue and cry about the need to protect Ukrainian democracy and oppose Russian aggression. The war that ensued has gone bad for the U.S. and NATO because it was false from the start. The U.S. backed an actor and former comedian as Ukraine's president and pumped him up as a latter-day Churchill who could fight to the last Ukrainian. Biden still calls it a success, a sign of difficulty distinguishing his own propaganda from reality. About China, the war planners and D.C. politicians are frustrated. They wanted it to be their war of choice, following the pivot to Asia announced in 2011. Breaking with the one China policy agreed to in the 1970s, they're trying to foment separatism in Taiwan and use it to weaken and divide China. They tried the same earlier with Hong Kong and with Tibet in previous decades. They have hoped to stop China's rise by weakening it however possible. Michael Pompeo's rants about genocide in China's far western province of Xinjiang were part of the effort, but the results have been illusory as China continues to rise and sticks with its policy of common prosperity for a shared future. Deceit is not enough. Deceit is combined with a war against disinformation designed to suppress anything but the official narrative. The relentless Western narrative that the West is noble while Russia and China are evil is simple-minded and extraordinarily dangerous, Columbia University professor Jeffrey Sachs has said. It's an attempt to manipulate public opinion. Dissent is met with repression. Students for Justice in Palestine and similar groups have been banned at numerous universities. Presidents of Ivy League schools were forced to resign in an AIPAC-sponsored campaign to suppress anti-Zionist activists by smearing them as anti-Semitic. Then there's the case of Julian Assange, who is now facing extradition from England to the U.S. after years of torture. He is charged with espionage because he publicized information about U.S. crimes in Iraq and faces up to 175 years in prison, a virtual death penalty, for practicing honest journalism. If the U.S. cared about honest journalism, Assange would get a prize, but he is barely mentioned in the mainstream media. The rise of social media has helped break the grip of the official information monopoly. Even though Jeffrey Sachs has said he can't even get an anti-war op-ed published in the New York Times or Washington Post, he has become famous on YouTube. So have turncoat intelligence analysts like Scott Ritter, Ray McGovern, and others. The Palestinian resistance movement itself has been a major force in breaking through the media smokescreen. The side of Israel's saturation bombing of homes, hospitals, and schools in Gaza has brought millions into the streets, just as scenes of Vietnamese children running away naked from napalm attacks ignited a storm of anti-war protest decades ago. They have inspired non-Zionist Jews everywhere to say, "Not in our name," and expose the lie that opposing U.S.-backed Israeli genocide genocide is somehow anti-Semitic. Scenarios for Endgame. At the start of 2024, after 3 months of war in Gaza and nearly 2 years in Ukraine, post-war plans became news items. Blinken took off on another major Middle East tour, stating goals of increased humanitarian assistance to Gaza, steps to protect Palestinian civilians and allow them to return to their homes, and plans to soften Israel's bombing attacks. But the U.S. continues to send tons of bombs and other munitions to Israel. If they want to soften Israel's bombing attacks, they could stop sending the bombs. Before Blinken took off on his peace tour, protesters arrived at his Virginia residence and splashed fake blood on his government vehicle and held signs branding him as a war criminal. Blinken intends to tackle the thorny topics of plans for governing Gaza and prospects for reaching a political solution between Israel and the Palestinians once this conflict is over, the New York Times report said. But Netanyahu says he is proud to have blocked a Palestinian state during his multiple turns as prime minister since the 1990s, and Israel continues the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and its plans for Israelis to reoccupy the enclave. The U.S. officially wants a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza after the war, viewing it as a path toward a two-state solution. That would involve crushing Hamas and its Palestinian resistance allies first, but many people question whether resolving to destroy such a deeply entrenched organization was ever realistic, even the Times reports. Palestinians are open to any proposal for a final and complete ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, but are opposed to administrations imposed by Israel or the U.S., said Hamas leader Osama Hamdan at a Beirut press conference December 28th. Following the January 2nd targeted Israeli assassination of a top Hamas leader in Beirut, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah warned Israel against waging war on Lebanon. If the enemy thinks of waging a war on Lebanon, we will fight without restraint, without rules, without limits, and without restrictions, Nasrallah said. The Yemenis have said the same. Regarding a wider regional war, there is an internal debate in the State Department. Hawks, led by Victoria Nuland, opposed Blinken's moderate stand. The Hawks tend to prevail in such debates. From Lebanon to the Red Sea, a broader conflict with Iran looms, was the headline in the New York Times, page 1, on January 7th. Iran is posing a new challenge to the West, the article says, this time with Russia and China on its side. Translation: a regional war could become a global war. Support to Ukraine has begun to erode. Meanwhile, on the Ukraine front, the Russians are winning. U.S. leaders are groping to deal with it. The political willingness to continue providing military and economic support to Ukraine has begun to erode in both the United States and Europe, end quote, say top U.S. foreign policy leaders Richard Haass and Charles Kupchan, writing in Foreign Affairs, November 17, 2023. Quote, the time has come for Washington to lead efforts to forge a new policy that sets attainable goals. They cite the enormous human and economic costs of the war and the reality that Russia has succeeded, end quote. The conflict in Gaza has, quote, grabbed the world's attention, relegating the war in Ukraine to the back burner. The issue is not only that Washington is distracted, the U.S. military has only finite resources, and U.S. defense industrial base has far too limited production capacity. The United States is stretched thin as it supports two partners engaged in hot wars, end quote. In an earlier Foreign Affairs article, April 13, 2023, the same authors said, quote, the United States must prepare for potential military action in Asia and the Middle East. They add that the war is imposing high costs on the global economy, and economic duress is triggering political unrest and is also polarizing the international system, end quote. The solution they offer is, quote, a ceasefire in place, unquote. A ceasefire, they add, would save lives, allow economic reconstruction to get underway, and enable Ukraine to devote incoming Western arms to investing in its long-term security rather than to quickly expending weaponry on a deadlocked battlefield, end quote. So the proposal is not for a complete ceasefire. Quote, Ukraine could continue using long-range weapons, naval assets, and covered operations to strike at Russian positions in rear areas and in Crimea, raising the costs of continuing occupation, close quote. The foreign affairs leaders admit it's, quote, likely that Moscow would spurn a ceasefire proposal, end quote. That's a good bet. In realistic terms, the Ukrainian forces and their NATO backers are exhausted. Russian forces are establishing security for Russian speakers in eastern and southern Ukraine and defending their self-determination. In effect, they are implementing the Minsk Accords, which all parties agreed to years ago. Meanwhile, the sanctions only stimulated Russia to align itself economically with India and China and the rest of the global South. The main victim of the sanctions was the Western European economy, a fantasy world. Western leaders like the foreign affairs writers continue to live in a fantasy world where they're on top. Their current proposal is modeled on the armed truce in Korea, established 7 decades ago. That truce was meant to maintain intense pressure on China, which had helped the Koreans resist the U.S. onslaught. A lot has changed in 7 decades. Most importantly, China is no longer exhausted from a century of humiliation and 3 decades of revolutionary war. Its leader, Xi Jinping, has reaffirmed China's close friendship with Russia. China has presented a peace plan to the West to resolve the Ukraine crisis. French President Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, and European Commission President van der Leyen all visited Beijing to secure economic ties with China. Europe trades more with China than the U.S. The Chinese newspaper Global Times reported that, quote, after concluding his visit to China, Macron emphasized that the great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building its strategic autonomy. The paradox would be that, overcome with panic, we believe we are just America's followers, end quote. The Global Times report says, quote, Macron is warning Europe not to go so far on this issue and risk damaging Europe's own interests. Macron's stressing the need for Europe's strategic autonomy was a result of a sober awakening from the U.S.'s selfish policies on Europe, especially since the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and also from being emboldened by his very successful trip to China, during which he saw China's goodwill toward France and the huge potential of cooperation with China, end quote. Following the European visits to China, Brazil's President Lula da Silva was China's next state visitor. The New York Times report was headlined, Brazil's Lula meets Xi in China as they seek path to peace in Ukraine, end quote. They want China's peace plan to be the basis for talks. The Times report said U.S. and some European officials have been critical of China's plan, quote, because China has not suggested that Russian forces must withdraw from occupied Ukrainian territory, end quote. Lula also wants other countries like South Africa, India, and Indonesia to help mediate the conflict. They also have not signed on to isolating Russia. As part of his visit to China, Lula helped inaugurate his political ally Dilma Rousseff as president of the new development bank set up by the BRICS nations. Rousseff was Brazil's president from 2011 to 2016, when she was impeached in a soft coup backed by the U.S. At the inauguration ceremony, Lula said, "Why should every country have to be tied to the dollar for trade? Who decided the dollar would be the world's currency?" He added that no bank should be asphyxiating countries' economies the way the IMF is doing now with Argentina, or the way they did with Brazil for a long time, and every third world country, end quote. Lula's comments are a signal of the changed environment in the world. He also called for China's territorial integrity to be respected with regard to Taiwan, as Macron had done. Just before hosting these high-level visits from France, the EU, and Brazil, China hosted the leaders of Iran and Saudi Arabia, scoring possibly the most significant peace agreement of this century so far. No military guarantees were needed to convince Iran and Saudi Arabia to abandon hostilities. Instead, the parties agreed to peace on the basis of cooperation in attractive trade deals with China. It's a new approach, part of China's global security initiative concept. There is no guarantee that a similar approach could work for peace between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and the EU and NATO. In all these cases, the main obstacle is the United States, which does not want peace based on mutual cooperation. But the U.S. may not have a choice, either in the Ukraine conflict or in Western Asia or against China itself. A new movement. The role of popular protest in all this is significant. Digging out the truth and spreading it is not enough. People are hitting the streets in protest and in serious efforts to stop the war machine. Yara Shufani of the Palestine Youth Movement says it's a major watershed moment where the Palestinian youth movement has been a part of a movement in North America and Britain to shut down industry and organize mass mobilizations across the world and across North America and Europe, end quote. It goes further, she suggests, quote, we're building a broad coalition of national liberation struggles, of working class struggles, of left struggles, and Arab and Palestinian and Muslim communities are coming together. Now, she says, we have work to do to channel this moment into serious political organization. And I think what we're seeing is actually the beginning of that, end quote. The Palestinians are leading the way. Their resistance, with massive global support in the face of attempted genocide, has exposed the moral and political bankruptcy of both Israel and its U.S. sponsor. The apparent unity of the apartheid settler state is beginning to crack. While the Israelis want to expand their assault on Gaza to a regional war and force the United States to come to their rescue, they're betting on a time-worn balance of forces that is no longer valid. Now, both Israel and the U.S. are isolated globally. The people who live in historic Palestine, of all religions, will gradually conclude that peaceful coexistence is possible and is much safer than apartheid. The stakes are high. What if the U.S. war machine can be stopped and the U.S. disarmed? It may seem like a distant hope now, but the progression of current events could change that. The neocons in Washington are gambling big time with their proxy war against Russia, support of Israeli genocide in Gaza, and their escalating threats against China. What if they lose? The Palestinians refuse to retreat and are frustrating Israel's effort to crush their resistance. Russia is determined not to lose because if it were to lose, it would be broken up like Yugoslavia and the USSR. And defeating China is not likely to be any easier for the U.S. than its adventures in Korea and Vietnam. Probably much harder. The U.S. war on Vietnam caused severe damage to the U.S. economy, ultimately leading to the end of the gold standard in 1971. The shift to the dollar standard, sometimes called the petrodollar standard, has worked well for the U.S. since then, but things are changing fast. Economist Michael Hudson says the U.S.-NATO confrontation with Russia in Ukraine is achieving just the opposite of America's aim of preventing China, Russia, and their allies from acting independently of U.S. control over their trade and investment policy. Naming China as America's main long-term adversary, the Biden administration's plan was to split Russia away from China and then cripple China's own military and economic viability, end quote. Instead, the alliance between Russia and China has become stronger and has attracted support from an increasing number of countries throughout the world. The U.S. managed to bludgeon its European allies to go along with war, even against their own interests. But for how long? The boomerang effect of sanctions against Russia has led to economic crisis and social instability in Europe, threatening NATO unity. Meanwhile, the effect of the savage sanctions and the proxy war has been to drive Russia and China together, joining with Iran, India, and other allies, Hudson says. For the first time since the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations in 1955, a critical mass is able to be mutually self-sufficient to start the process of achieving independence from dollar diplomacy, end quote. China's central bank has taken a series of steps to accelerate the global drive toward de-dollarization, challenging the hegemony of the greenback. With the sudden emergence of de-dollarization, the U.S. economic grip on the world will diminish fairly fast. As that happens, the U.S. is sure to become even more recklessly aggressive, but it is not likely to win militarily against either Russia or China, or successfully fight a regional war in West Asia. The U.S. is overextended globally, and a majority of its people are tired of war, to say the least. Instead, we may begin to see possibilities of a post-U.S. imperialism world. It may involve passing through intensified dangers of fascism, like the fascism the U.S. has imposed in Ukraine and elsewhere, but those dangers could be mitigated by economic and political collapse at the top of U.S. society. Glimpses of this can already be seen with the disarray in Washington and the beginning of a banking crisis. This disarray could offer opportunities for positive change. What could positive change look like? Fighting against fascism can galvanize ordinary people to organize and fight back. Ajamu Baraka, co-founder of the Black Alliance for Peace, says, quote, "The left in the U.S. must organize an authentic radical opposition to the ruling class and have a clear political program rooted in a people-centered human rights framework. We need to revive the anti-war movement," Baraka said. "We need to demand that the resources transferred from people's needs to the military must cease. We need to place the plight of the people at the center. We need to recenter self-determination, social justice, and equality to develop effectively. We have to struggle for minimum programs of unity among the authentic left," end quote. This is a virtual call for a united front against imperialism and fascism. Easier said than done, of course, but such a call is a crucial first step. Just starting the process of building such a united front through joint actions, conferences, and other unity-building activities in dozens of localities and regional centers could trigger a chain reaction of groups coming together as well as many people joining the effort. It could recall the popular crescendo Dr. King aroused as he organized rallies and marches in the 1960s. In his historic 1967 speech at Riverside Church, a year before he was assassinated, King said, "Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out in a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism." The sometimes hostile world King mentioned was real. It killed him. A united front will also encounter hostility, repression, reaction, infiltration, police violence, and fascist mobs, as well as vilification by politicians and mass media. It will need to organize to counter all this. Voices across the country have already been calling for unified efforts against both war and fascism. Immigrant groups have had to reach out for help against repression wherever they are. They and their support groups are likely to become part of a united front. This type of organizing can also stimulate a broader people's democratic front, focusing on peace and democratic rights, as well as providing legal support and protection. These two fronts together can grow to include a large percentage of the general population, unions, churches, community organizations, and a wide variety of social groups. Such a mushrooming progressive coalition could turn the tide of militarism and fascist and racist reaction that has already shown itself. It would provide an answer to the noxious narratives of politicians and mass media to make it seem that everyone is for war, racism, and reaction, and it would offer a vehicle for an escalated battle for peace, as well as economic and democratic rights. Baraka says, quote, "The system is no longer able to shield the reality of the profound gaps in wealth and in the suffering and immiseration of the working class and the poor. People know the crisis that caused the crash of 2008 was never really overcome. It's increasingly hard to convince people they're getting either a fair deal or straight answers," end quote. Biden's justification of Israel's slaughter in Palestine has exposed his hysterical denunciations of Russia's aggression against Ukraine as pure hypocrisy. As U.S. bombs and tanks crush Palestinians and sacrifice Ukrainians, people start to make connections. About democracy, Barak says, there's no democracy here. We need to expand the concept of democracy, dismantle the duopoly, win ranked choice voting, ban PACs, push for democratic reforms. The capitalists are providing opportunities for us if we can see them. They saw what happened with the George Floyd protests, and they were shaken to the core by it. The working class, organized and unorganized, remains pivotal. They're on the move. Dozens and dozens of wildcat strikes and the emergence of new formations. They're putting pressure on the official union leadership. And there's hope from the South. In South America, there are very effective social movements that have seized nominal state power in various places. That represents hope. We're seeing movements leading the way towards a transformation of power, end quote. A major turning point. The Ukraine conflict promises to constitute a major turning point, says Radhika Desai, author of Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. She writes, quote, "The conflict that the West calls Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Moscow its special military operation for Ukraine's demilitarization and denazification is not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It is a phase in the hybrid war that the United States has been waging for over a century against any country that chooses an economic path other than subordination to itself or the broader capitalist world. In this war, Ukraine is the terrain and a pawn, one that can be and is being sacrificed." Desai says this more than century-long project has reached a tipping point where U.S. actions are not merely failures, they are counterproductive, accelerating the shift in the world's center of gravity away from itself and the West towards socialist China, end quote. But this does not mean China will be the successor to U.S. hegemony. Quote, "China will certainly overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world, but it will still remain one among other weighty economies," end quote. The bottom line is the U.S. will no longer be able to control the world. As its empire collapses, new possibilities will emerge across the globe and here at home. Its It's a reminder of what happened when Dorothy landed in the mythical land of Oz in the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. When a very ordinary, that is, working-class girl is caught in a storm and swept away, she inadvertently lands on a wicked witch who has terrorized everyone in the land of Oz. She inadvertently kills the witch. The people come out dancing and singing, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." People in real life will come out dancing and singing if we can kill the witch that rules and oppresses us. Radhika Desai concludes her book with the programmatic statement, "Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism," a manifesto issued in 2021 during the storm of global pandemic and war. It has been signed by thousands of people around the world, individuals, organizations, and national leaders. Quote, "We must oppose the U.S.-sponsored imperialist new Cold War and build an ambitious multilateral international governance," the manifesto says. "We must replace imperialistic domination with common values and principles to tackle common challenges. International governance needs to reflect the world's objective and developing pluripolarity. The original ideals of the United Nations Charter and the principles of peaceful coexistence advocated by the non-aligned movement are excellent foundations for further constructing alternatives to institutions of U.S. and Western dominance." End quote. Saying all this doesn't make it so. Getting there, as the saying goes, is half the fun and is our current challenge. It's a long march, of course, but there really are no shortcuts. In many parts of the world, the process has already begun. In some Latin American countries, neoliberal and proto-fascist regimes have been replaced. The CIA has fought back with coups in Bolivia and Peru, but the most recent coup in Bolivia was reversed. There have been more than 190 coups and revolutions in Bolivia since its independence in 1825, so Bolivia holds the record, but there have been innumerable coups throughout the Americas in the past 2 centuries. In most cases, the coup's purpose was to restore capitalist control after local people moved to reclaim their national patrimony. Pedro Castillo, the president of Peru who was deposed in December 2022, had condemned foreign countries for pillaging his country. He wanted to renegotiate contracts to ensure 70% of all proceeds from mining would go to the state to fund social programs. "Let's be clear," Castillo said, "these decades of betrayal, corruption, and cynicism are the symptoms of this neoliberal system dedicated exclusively to the exploitation of our people and natural resources for the benefit of a few scoundrels." He declared, "We are rescuing the resources of the country for all Peruvians." His goal, "We want our natural resources to directly benefit the people," end quote. The U.S. ambassador in Peru, Lisa Kenna, is a CIA veteran who supported the December 2022 parliamentary coup that overthrew Castillo. One day before the December 7th coup, the former CIA officer turned U.S. ambassador met with Peru's defense minister, who then told the country's powerful military to turn against President Castillo. After the coup, Kenna met with Peru's mining and energy ministers to discuss investments. Europe is now importing Peruvian liquid natural gas to replace what it lost when the Nord Stream pipeline blew up. Leaders of Peru's neighbors in the rest of Latin America have condemned the coup. In 2019, following the U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia, electric car magnate Elon Musk twittered, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it." In Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba, the people and their revolutionary governments deal with it by defending their sovereignty. Many people in the U.S. and everywhere are dealing with it by changing sides in support of the victims. The day of reckoning is likely to come sooner than expected as a result of the extremely bad gamble the U.S. neocons are taking against China, Russia, and the people of Palestine. For many, that day cannot come soon enough. As U.S. hegemony wanes, new possibilities will emerge across the globe and here at home. The maniacs in Washington may try to do what they've done before, using extreme measures to hold back change. But popular forces in this country and around the world can and must intervene to protect our interests and make change happen. A new multipolar world is dawning that will replace the old imperialist order with peace and common prosperity for a shared future. It is the destiny of today's generation to hasten its arrival.